Before anyone understood why the night went wrong, there was a moment, thin as a held breath, when a glass hovered in the air and the entire room forgot how to move. Secrets don't announce themselves. They seep, they wait, they listen. And on that night, silence was already choosing sides. If you find yourself drawn to stories about quiet courage, dangerous power, and the cost of paying attention, take a second to like and subscribe. You'll want to stay close to where this goes. I was there because I always was, because places like Rosario's didn't change shifts just because the city's pulse had quickened after dark, and because waiting tables taught you to be invisible until invisibility stopped being safe. The rain had been tapping the windows all evening like a warning no one wanted to translate, and the restaurant smelled of wine, butter, and the low electric hum of men who came armed with manners instead of smiles, which was how I knew it wasn't an ordinary Thursday. Even before the three men asked for booth 7, the one no one liked because it swallowed light and returned nothing but echoes, and because they spoke in murmurs that bent around names without ever landing on them. The kind of whispers you learn to recognize when you've been poor long enough to know that money makes its own weather. I carried plates past them twice and learned their rhythms the way you learn a song, without trying, the youngest checking his watch like time owed him something, the one with the scar watching the door as if it might confess, the heavy one drumming a napkin into a shape that looked like patience but wasn't, and when I leaned to refill a glass I caught a sentence that didn't belong in a dining room. When he speaks, we move, and I didn't stop, because stopping was how you told on yourself, and because you never assume you've heard the whole truth until the rest of it finds you, which it did when the front door opened, and the room adjusted the way rooms do when a man with gravity enters. Silvio Rinaldi didn't look like a headline, not at first, just a well-tailored inevitability with silver at his temples and eyes that kept inventory, and he smiled as if the world had already agreed with him, which it mostly had, and he took his table in the center without asking, because asking was for men who needed permission, and Maria hovered, and the waitstaff aligned, and conversation softened, and I felt the floor settle under a weight it knew. And I saw booth 7 stiffen like a photograph coming into focus, hands shifting beneath jackets, breath finding a shared count, and I remembered something my mother used to say about storms, that the worst part was the pause before the first crack of thunder, because everything alive knows what comes next, and Silvio began the ritual that made tourists lean forward and locals look away. The toast he delivered the way a conductor lifts a baton, and I understood then that the sentence I'd overheard had been incomplete, because the rest of it was written into the man's habits, the single word he always used, the hinge the night had been built on. I didn't think about courage, not really, because courage suggests choice, and this felt more like gravity, like the moment when you step off a curb and realize the street has already decided whether you'll make it across. So I did what waitresses do when they need to be where they shouldn't. I smiled, I poured, I leaned in close enough that it looked like care, and I whispered to a man whose name weighed more than mine ever would, "Don't speak, stay still," and the air went thin enough to cut yourself on, because he froze exactly as if he'd been waiting for someone to tell him the truth in a voice small enough not to draw blood. His eyes moved, not wildly, but with the precision of a chess player recognizing a board that had lied to him, and he lowered the glass as if the idea had been his, and said nothing, and that nothing traveled faster than words ever could, because confusion rippled where certainty had been rehearsed, and booth 7 fractured into glances that didn't match, the scarred man's jaw tightening as if the room had insulted him, the youngest blinking as if he'd missed a step, the heavy one squeezing linen into pulp, and without the word they'd anchored themselves to, they were suddenly just men in a restaurant with plans that required faith, and faith evaporates under fluorescent lights. I stepped back on legs that pretended they were steady, aware for the first time that I had been seen by the one person who mattered and by the wrong ones too, and the night lurched forward pretending nothing had happened, which is how danger prefers it, and Silvio took a sip without ceremony, and people laughed because laughter is a habit, and plates clinked, and rain continued its argument with the glass, but the center had shifted, and I felt it like a change in pressure, the way divers do before their ears catch up, and I knew the cost was already accruing interest. Later, though. Later is a flexible word when you're counting heartbeats instead of minutes. I noticed how the men from booth 7 paid in a hurry that tried to look casual, how their eyes swept the room with a promise they didn't bother to make pretty, and how Silvio's gaze followed them not as prey, but as numbers being recalculated, and how his people moved without moving. A choreography you only notice when you're about to be in it. And when my phone vibrated in my apron like a trapped insect, I didn't have to look to know the message wouldn't be kind, because the universe had already decided to stop being subtle, and I understood then that saving a man like Silvio Rinaldi didn't mean applause or escape. It meant proximity, which is another word for danger dressed as warmth. And as the door closed on the rain and the night reset its face, I wiped the table that didn't need wiping and wondered which part of me I'd just traded. Because some bargains are struck without signatures, and the silent side chosen was already asking to be kept. By the time the chairs were flipped onto tables and the last candle guttered into smoke, the night had decided not to let me go. And I understood that because Silvio Rinaldi didn't leave when everyone else did, he stayed seated in the quiet like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew he would survive, his presence changing the shape of the room even after the customers were gone. And I felt it in the way Marco, who I would later learn never stood where he couldn't see every exit, leaned near the door with his jacket unbuttoned just enough to suggest honesty, and in the way Dom at the bar polished a glass that was already clean while watching me with eyes pale enough to feel surgical. Silvio finally looked at me the way a person looks at a sentence they intend to reread slowly, and when he spoke my name, my real one, not the easy nickname on my apron, I realized how thoroughly I'd been noticed, which was the moment fear stopped being abstract and settled into my bones, because powerful men don't ask questions unless the answers belong to them, and he asked anyway, quietly, why I had told him to stay still, not as an accusation but as a measurement, and I told the truth because lies have a smell, and his world was built to detect it. I told him about Booth 7, about the sentence that had crawled under my skin, about the word he didn't say, and as I spoke I watched his face do almost nothing, which was worse than anger, because it meant he was filing the information, where decisions lived, and when I finished there was a pause long enough to hear the refrigerator hum like an anxious witness, and he nodded once, a small motion that carried the weight of a signature, and said I had good ears, which felt less like praise and more like a job description. The men from Booth 7 didn't make it far. News travels fast when it's afraid of being late, and I learned that without seeing anything I could later describe to a court, only by the way Marco checked his phone, and the way Dom's mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile, and by the way Silvio stood and placed a hand on the back of my chair with a familiarity that hadn't been earned but was now unavoidable, telling me to go home, to sleep, to answer no unknown numbers, and to trust that the night would finish what it had started, which was the kind of promise you don't test. And I went, walking into the rain with my coat pulled tight, and the sense that the streetlights were suddenly insufficient. My phone vibrating anyway with messages that didn't bother to hide their intent. We know where you live. We know what you did. This isn't over. Each word tightening the circle until my apartment felt like a cardboard prop. I didn't sleep so much as wait, listening to the building breathe, to footsteps that might or might not belong, to the elevator cable sigh like an old confession. And when morning came it didn't bring relief, only clarity, because clarity is cruel that way, and by noon a car I'd never seen before idled across the street, not threatening, not hiding, just present, and Marco stepped out as if he'd always belonged there, saying Silvio wanted to see me, now, and the word wanted carried enough gravity to erase alternatives. The house wasn't a house so much as a statement pretending to be architecture, all stone and sight lines and the software of systems designed to anticipate regret. And Silvio met me not like a king, but like a man who understood leverage, offering coffee I didn't drink and a chair I didn't trust. And he explained the world I'd brushed against with the patience of someone who enjoys teaching only because teaching reveals who's listening. He told me about betrayal as attacks, about rituals as vulnerabilities, about how silence could be used to sharpen a blade or blunt one. And he told me that the men who'd planned to kill him were already gone in the way storms disappear from maps while the damage remains. And then he told me what he wanted from me, which wasn't loyalty. Loyalty is assumed or enforced, but attention, the ability to notice the small fractures before they become explosions, to hear what people say when they think the room has agreed not to remember it, to be present without being seen. And I laughed then, a sound that surprised us both, because the idea that I had stumbled into something like usefulness felt absurd and inevitable at the same time. And he didn't laugh back, only watched, and said this wasn't a request, it was an arrangement already underway, because the men who had threatened me wouldn't stop until they believed I belonged to him, and belief, in his experience, was cheaper than mercy. The days that followed rearranged my life with a gentleness that felt predatory. My apartment emptied without ceremony, my job transformed without explanation, Rosario's renovated as if the night needed a new skin, and me positioned where listening was both talent and obligation. And I learned the geography of power the way you learn a city, by getting lost and pretending it was intentional. Learning which rooms lied with their lighting and which people lied with their mouths. Learning that fear announces itself differently, depending on how much money it has, and that silence is not the absence of sound but the presence of choice. And in quieter moments, when the ring Silvio gave me, heavy, declarative, caught the light, I wondered if I'd mistaken a rescue for a recruitment. But the thought never finished forming, because thoughts like that don't survive long in places where survival is managed. And when Silvio raised a glass days later in a room full of donors and enemies and ghosts, and paused long enough for the old habit to itch, he looked at me without looking, and didn't speak, and the room exhaled without knowing why. And I understood then that the night at Rosario's hadn't been an interruption, it had been a beginning, and that whatever I'd saved him from, I had stepped fully into, because some silences, once chosen, don't let you go. It ended the way most things in Silvio Rinaldi's world ended, quietly, decisively, and without witnesses who could afford to remember, because conclusions, like power, worked best when they didn't announce themselves, and by the time the city realized something had shifted, the shift had already hardened into fact. The men who had planned to kill him were reduced to rumors that people stopped repeating after they noticed which names no longer opened doors, and the alliances that had wavered realigned themselves with the efficiency of metal snapping back into shape. While I learned that being close to the center didn't feel dramatic at all, it felt administrative, a series of rooms and conversations and glances where my job was not to intervene but to notice, to hear the hesitation before a lie and the confidence after one, to understand when silence meant safety and when it meant a trap being set. And Silvio watched this transformation with the detached satisfaction of a man who preferred results to gratitude. The last test came without ceremony, at a public gala thick with money and intention, where I was meant to be visible enough to invite mistakes. And when a former ally tried to draw me aside under the pretense of concern, his voice smooth and his eyes sharp with calculation, I stayed still and said nothing, letting the pause stretch until he filled it with too much, and that was enough. Because Marco appeared as if summoned by punctuation, and the man's future narrowed in a way he immediately understood. And later, when the room settled back into its practiced indifference, Silvio raised his glass and finally spoke the word he had once withheld, not as a ritual, but as a punctuation mark, and the sound of it felt like a door closing on something that no longer existed. Afterward, when we sat alone in the quiet that followed applause, he asked me if I ever regretted that night at Rosario's, the whisper, the choice, and I told him the truth again, that regret implies an alternate path you believe would have saved you, and I no longer believe that, because some lives pivot on moments that feel small only because they happen inside. And he nodded, satisfied, not with me, but with the order of things restored. And as I walked back through the city that no longer noticed me except when it needed to, I understood that I hadn't been swallowed by darkness or rescued into light. I had stepped into a narrow corridor between them where attention was currency and silence was law, and the glass that once hovered in the air no longer haunted me, because I knew now that stillness wasn't fear, it was control, and that the most dangerous stories never end with noise, they end with everything exactly where it's meant to be.